Hi. Let's begin with a hypothetical. Let's say that you have a woman of color. Let's say that this woman goes and speaks at a convention. Let's say that this convention is, generally speaking, about progressivism and leftism in the legal community. Let's say that this woman goes specifically to speak on the subject of abolitionism, right? She represents herself as an abolitionist. She believes that the that the system of governance using policing and police force is fundamentally unjust, and that any use of that is going to lead to violence, either at a systemic or a micro sort of scale, right? So let's say that that's the person that we're working with. And let's say that she goes to speak at this conference. And let's say that most of the people who speak at this conference have good things to say, are very informative, are very useful, teach the people who attend a lot of things. But let's say that this woman is a little different. Let's say that some people say that she is a little provocative, and that other people say that actually she's pretty real. Let's say that, for example, she gets up on the stage and in front of everyone acknowledges, wow, there are a lot of white people here and like barely any black people, like at all, right? Let's say that she says something like that and similar things to that effect. Let's say that this makes some people uncomfortable and other people it really empowers them, right? It makes them feel like, wow, this person like actually kind of gets it. Let's say that while she's giving a lecture, there are some times where arguably she does some things which aren't the greatest. Whether it's asking someone a question and shaming them if they get it wrong, or asking people intentionally leading questions. Again, not the hypothetical isn't supposing whether or not these things are morally right or wrong. Let's just say that some people think that that this person is in the wrong for doing these things, right? Let's say that after her presentation, some of the people are a little ticked that, they feel like they were sort of accused of being racist, for not, for whatever reason, whether it's not knowing all the answers to the questions that they were asked, or being sort of ousted, or not ousted, but almost shamed, or what they believe is shamed in front of everyone else at the conference. Let's say that there are some people who feel a little ticked or personally affronted, right? And let's say that after this presentation, there's a party with some alcohol. Let's say that one of these people who got a little ticked, let's say that it's a law student who's a white girl who has a couple drinks and sees the speaker at this event, and whether it's because of her drinking or just her personal feelings or whatever, goes over and talks to the speaker. And let's say that the girl says something to the effect of the speaker of, hey, I feel like I don't appreciate the way that you said some of the things up there. And let's say that this conversation continues, the speaker feels a little uncomfortable and eventually says, hey, you're saying some racist things. Let's say that this girl is even more ticked by that and goes to the management, the people who are running this conference. Let's say that this girl goes and tells the people at the conference, hey, the speaker, that woman just called me racist, or something such of the similar. And let's say that the people who run the conference immediately take the side of the white girl and cancel the speaker's next event for the upcoming day without talking to the speaker, without getting her side of the story, just automatically cancel it. Question: out of all the parties that we've talked about, who is in the wrong? So this past weekend, I actually went on a trip to something called the Robert Cover Retreat. Essentially, what it is it's a conference slash retreat. They sit like it functions like a conference in that it's something that a lot of law students and legal professionals go um, to generally talk about progressivism and leftism in the legal community, right? And what that looks like for up and coming lawyers and us students, in the community, in the legal community, to give us some ideas on how our development should progress, as we go forward. And but it's also sort of called a retreat in that it's whenever you think of a conference, you think like, oh yeah, everyone's in a suit and tie, everyone's very formal, everyone is very no, that's not the way that it was, right? Like it's very informal. Most people are wearing like t-shirts, slacks, like like very very like sort of dressed down sort of a situation, right? It's at like a campground like way outside in the country. It's a very lax kind of environment where you're supposed to build, like you're supposed to learn things, but you're also supposed to build relationships with the people who are there. And to that extent, I really, really enjoyed myself, right? I went and I met a lot of really cool people. Ended up making like a lot of friends from like crazy like Yale. Like I ended up meeting like a couple people from there. One of whom is like I made like one of my closest friends ever over there. Oh my god, like we just got super close. If you're watching, hi. Um, but yeah, so it was a really cool event for me, developing my ideas, learning more about like different kinds of ways to engage with nonprofit development, how to run a nonprofit, how to open one, and like different ways to take it, whether it's like advocating policy or getting involved in like direct representation. Like there's just a lot of really cool stuff that I took from there, right? Took a lot of notes. But what we're talking about here is perhaps the one of the main things that happened over this weekend, right? And the story doesn't really have its full context unless I sort of start at the beginning, right? This doesn't necessarily directly involve me, but weirdly I became like a part of the happenings. So the first day of the retreat, right? So it was a Friday, and most people drove like up to like 7. Like I drove 7 hours with another friend of mine from Baltimore to I think it was in Connecticut. I can't exactly remember where. I just put the address into my phone and just drove from there. And it was like a 7-hour drive. It was like way up the East Coast, and by the time we got there, it was like dinner time, right? So I unpacked all my stuff, went over to the hall, and there were a bunch of people in there. But we all had pre-made assigned tables, and so I sat with a group of people who I didn't know, and I don't know, just started mingling, right? It started as like awkward small talk, but eventually I was talking to, weirdly enough, another girl from Yale. I eventually learned that as we were throughout the course of our conversation. I didn't know that going in, but like it was super cool. We talked about like how the international community regards American lawyers, which is not great. like the international legal community thinks that American lawyers are pretty shite, So that was a really cool conversation. But eventually, sort of the main speakers, the people who were running the event, got up, and we literally went around the entire room and passed around a microphone, and everyone introduced themselves, right? Like their name, their pronouns, which I appreciated, and and where, like what law school they went to, or if they were practicing, like where they were practicing, right? And so, like I didn't think anything of it. Like I'm comfortable speaking in front of people publicly. In fact, I was actually feeling particularly confident because, in case you can't tell, like I am very, like I'm comfortable with my voice, and I can project a lot, and I can, take up a room, and so like I was at the second table that got the microphone, and mind you, like for reference, there are like I think like over 30-40 tables. Like there are a good amount of people in the room. And so eventually they handed the microphone to me, and the microphone was having like some issues, like it was a little staticky and whatnot. So eventually I got it, and I stood up and I tapped it, and I was like, honestly, can everyone hear me? And people looked around me and nodded, and I'm like, yeah. And so I was just like, all right, hi everyone, and I introduced myself, right? And I didn't use the microphone, and everyone heard me, and I thought it was going to be fine, until after I finished, there was a woman who was a woman of color who was sitting at a table just a little bit away from me, who wasn't like, I didn't think that she was a student. It looked like she was someone who was there in a professional capacity, right? And she, again, like the characterization of this, most people say that what she did was uncalled for. She told me that I needed to speak into the microphone because it would offend people who had disabilities who couldn't hear otherwise, or something to that effect. I was in sort of one of those deer in headlight moments. You know, I was like, wait, what the shit is happening? As she was talking to me, because I assumed I was just gonna like take an applause and sit down. And so I heard her say the words, and I was just like, what? And I just sort of awkwardly handed the microphone off to the next person. I didn't speak, and it was just like a really awkward thing. And I'm not saying that she was, I do not take the position that she was in the wrong. I had it later explained to me that she was saying like, hey, speaking to the microphone so that, you know, people with disabilities could hear you clearer, because like some people probably can't if they have like hearing problems in the room. But a lot of people came up to me like after that and throughout the weekend and said like, oh my God, she was so rude to you. Like she could have, like, sure, she could have said that, but she could have said it like in a much, you know, nicer sort of way. And so, and that's what people told me. And again, like, I'm not, like, I just sort of didn't want to dwell on it. Like, it was one of those things where I was like, I mean, I thought I had made like, I was about to cry. Like, I was about, like, I thought that, like, I thought I just offended, like, everyone in the room, you know, like, within my first couple minutes of being there. And so I just didn't dwell on it. Like, I didn't, you know, hold anything against her or anything like that. But it's an important part of the story because of where we're going to next, right? The following evening, so this was Saturday night, the same woman got up and gave a lecture, a keynote lecture about abolitionism, right? And effectively, you know, the way that she gave it paralleled the way that I framed the hypothetical, right? She made several acknowledgments and sort of call outs in ways that some people found very provocative, but which other people thought were kind of real, right? Like, yeah, there aren't really that many people of color in this room, and it's mostly white, which is weird because it's supposed to be like a progressive or diverse space, right? And so that was sort of the tone of her lecture, right? Without getting into specifics. I mean, like, I took several notes. Like, I learned a good amount. But yeah, and the rest is sort of hearsay. So, I mean, some of it, like, doesn't matter whether or not it's hearsay because the result is the same for consideration. But effectively, afterwards, the hearsay, the word of mouth goes that someone who was listening, supposedly a white girl who was a law student, got a little ticked because she may or may not have been kind of accused of being racist, or maybe she took that impression from the lecture, went and talked to the speaker after the fact, and then after the speaker apparently like defended herself and was like, hey, you or law school girl are kind of saying like kind of racist things, the law school girl got really ticked, went to one of the people who was running the event and told them like, hey, the speaker just called me racist. And so the people who ran the event immediately took her side and canceled the speaker's lecture for the next day. Without talking to the speaker, without getting her side of the story, just automatically canceled it, right? And literally the speaker didn't know that her second event was canceled until like the next day, like a half hour before it was supposed to take place, right? When this decision had been made like literally the previous night. again, that's hearsay, but a lot of people who I've talked to and people who've been involved sort of verified that story. And gosh, it's just a really, really weirdly ironic situation, because what this woman was doing, like, regardless of whether or not, like, there are lots of people who I think had some justifiable reasons for thinking that she could have phrased things better, or she could have, like, been a little nicer in her presentation, or she didn't have to, like, shame people for giving wrong answers during her lecture, right? Like, I think that there's a lot of room for that sort of discussion to take place, but that discussion never happened, right? And so it seems like a lot of the people who were running the event after this woman got up and gave her speech already was sort of like, they also shared the sentiment. They were also sort of ticked by her and kind of wanted to get her out of there, or at least that's the inference, just looking from the outside in. And it's so ironic because the reason she said those things on there, one of the main reasons, as she said it, was that there wasn't that many people of color there. And it seems like when she specifically addresses the main issue, like when her main issue that she's drawing to everyone's attention is that there's not a lot of representation from people of color, and then the people who are running the event actually, like, cancel her next lecture and kick her out, being one of the only people of color giving a lecture. It's ironic, right? It's painfully ironic in that, like, you're literally contributing to the problem that she is calling out. This was really awkward for me because due to the interaction that the two of us had at the first day, Saturday night after her lecture, a lot of people came up to me and sort of asked for my opinion. Like, they're like, hey, like, what do you think of what she did? Or, hey, like, what are your thoughts on this, that, and the other? And I just found that to be the oddest thing, right? People assumed that because of our interaction together that they wanted to put more weight in what I thought of her. And I mean, let's be clear, it's really not my place to say, right? Like, it's not my place, especially when there's, like, a very racial element to this. And let's be clear, like, I'm a white bitch, right? Like, that's just the way it is, right? And so it feels very weird when people are asking me, like, hey, so what did you think of what the woman of color said, Miss, white trans girl? And it's like, why are you asking me for my opinion? I mean, what kind of weight are you ascribing to it? It seems like you're trying to, because how it registered to me, right? And this is sort of the main reason I wanted to talk about this. I had a conversation that same night over, what had happened actually with I won't say their name just because, I don't know, I'm not sure if they would, like, I think that this story is just, like, very contentious. But I was having a conversation with someone that night, and we were talking about this lecture, right? And we were talking about whether or not, the way that she conducted it was appropriate. And I hear the arguments, like, the person who I was talking to took the position that, she could have made it, like, she could have conveyed things in a much more nicer, a much more diplomatic way, that she couldn't have shamed people, and that, there are a lot of other ways that she could have gone about it in order to, make, do better by the crowd, right? And I hear that, and that's, I think, a well-taken point, right? But honestly, what was weird was that it turns out that after the fact, some people had talked to the speaker, after, like, Sunday had, or, like, during the latter part of Sunday, like, after she had canceled, after she had tried to talk to the management, the friend who I drove there and back with said that she had spoken to her. And the speaker said that, she even had to change what she was originally going to say. Like, she originally changed the contents of her lecture because she recognized that the crowd was pretty white. And so, like, what she ended up delivering was, like, the watered down version, right? And it still was provocative, or other people found it to be provocative. And I think that says something about the nature of quote unquote liberalism, or people who identify as liberals, right? Whether or not you're taking liberal to mean like, like soft leaning left person, or like people who identify left generally, like there's a bunch of different definitions, but most of the people who were at this event sort of identified underneath that umbrella term. And so I think it says something interesting about the nature of it and the nature of the people who identify with it. So the conversation I was having with the person over, like the way that the lecturer conducted her lecture, right? They brought up the points I mentioned. I said, oh, that's all well and good, but it can be very hard, even when you're being reasonable and even when you're being real, if you are talking to a crowd that already thinks that they know the answers going in, right? If you're talking to a crowd that assumes sort of a moral high ground and assumes themselves out of a position to question what they already know, right? This discussion shifted for a little bit to like the nature of persuading people who are conservative, right? And reaching people who are conservative. I talked a bit about how I reach people who I've grown up with who are largely conservative, and how I talk to them about LGBT subjects, and especially relating to my person, but then also other left-leaning subjects, right? Like the election, and like convincing people that they should vote for Bernie, because hey, you should definitely vote for Bernie, like just saying. But anyway, and so we had this conversation, but I also drew notice to the fact that that problem definitely exists among conservatives, right? Like conservatives will specifically tune out a lot of liberal arguments because they just sort of assume on the front end that liberals are wrong, whether it's because they aren't realistic, whether or not it's because they are focusing too much on their feelings, whether or not it's being, it's because they're being too altruistic, whether or not it's because they're goddamn socialists, like, pick a reason, right? But they take those arguments like that, like people who are conservative take leftist arguments and just try to put them in a box. Innuendo Studios actually did a video on this, but just try to take those ideas and put them in different boxes so that they don't have to acknowledge them on their merits. And I think that's definitely true from my own personal experience, and also from just studying and reading political psychology. But I think that we also have to remember that anyone can do this, right? I mean, everyone has an ego, and everyone wants to believe themselves to be a good person. It's just a matter of it's just a difference in how that manifests when you're talking about people who are politically left or right. And so when you have people who are politically left-leaning, right, honestly, you can sometimes get the same issue. Because let's assume that you have people who have assumed themselves to take a certain moral high ground on a subject, and they're told that actually your understanding of that subject is fundamentally wrong. How do people react? When we were having this discussion, when the lecturer was giving her lecture, she brought up a lot of really radical ideas about police brutality, right? Like she said, for example, is there any instance where you can call a police officer which would not increase the likelihood of harm to another person, right? And there are a lot of people in the room who were really used to the idea of calling the police, and who wanted to believe that, and who, talked about like, hey, like I've called the police before, like they've helped me before in one way or another. But this is sort of where she would come, this is sort of where discussion would lead to the idea that, like, at least from her perspective as an abolitionist, that there are no appropriate times to call the police. I don't know if you can hear, but appropriately there are police sirens going on outside. Baltimore is wonderful. And so a lot of these ideas challenge some people's preconceptions, right? And, to most people in like further left-leaning spaces, like I know I'm probably talking to an audience that heard that question was like, oh yeah, you should like never call the police, right? But there might also be some people who would be like, all right, well, there's got to be like some times when you can call the police, right? And those arguments have merits of their own, and I'm not trying to assert a position on it. But the point is not whether or not those arguments are valid, but how people react to their premises. And the fact of the matter is, what you had here was someone who brought up some really radical ideas about abolition and about police, police brutality. And it really was, at the end of the day, as simple as her ideas were a little too radical for a lot of the people in the room, you know? And so when you end up in this sort of situation, what you have are a lot of people who are going to try and put that, at least from my view, into a box. Oh, well, she was being way too, way too harsh on people. Oh, she was not. And again, like, I'm not saying that she wasn't being too harsh on people, right? I think that is a discussion to be had. But when the result is people automatically sort of taking the first reason to kick her out the door, it really seems like people just wanted to get her out of there. Or at least that's my view. And so I guess what this really is saying, right? And people might not like hearing this, right? But really, this is just sort of a reminder to people who are, especially people on the left, that we might criticize people on the right, generally speaking, for taking certain logical shortcuts in their reasoning, and for those shortcuts to have detrimental effects on certain people or large groups of people in society. The Republican Party and like most policy they do. But no one is perfect, right? And if we do not carefully self-monitor ourselves and check ourselves when circumstances like these arise, then honestly, we can fall into the same trap. And considering that this was supposed to be an event full of all of the smartest, brightest, youngest, or not youngest, but like smartest and brightest young legal minds in the country, right? And especially those who are like supposedly the furthest left leaning, considering it happened there, it really can happen anywhere. And so we just need to be aware of that and self-monitor ourselves and learn from this going forward. This is not me admonishing the people who are running this. I think that they made a human error, but I think that there needs to be restitution, right? There needs to be dialogue about this. And if not, then, I talk to a lot of people who probably won't go back next year. And I'm honestly heavily considering that myself, right? And it's sad because this is an event that's had a lot of really good effects on people's lives, I got a lot from it, and it's probably going to influence a lot of what I do going forward. So I don't want to see it go. So yeah, those are my thoughts. But something else that was interesting that came out of that experience was that, I learned a lot more about sort of what I want to do, and what I'm really leaning towards is to hopefully eventually start my own nonprofit. And that's going to be a journey. What I would like to do is I would like to start a homeless outreach nonprofit, to be able to specifically like reach out to people who are like LGBT or within the queer community who are homeless, and to be able to offer them stable temporary housing and also long-term housing solutions, right? Like that seems to be that's where my passion is taking me. And again, that idea can be, it's subject to change in the future, but I've been stewing on it for a while, and that's very related to the work I did before law school. It's related to the work that I'm doing right now with the nonprofit I'm working with, and yeah. But if you would like to support me, that plug though, I have to. Like, I'm just starting. now have a Patreon, right? Which is, I guess, a thing. And so I have, like, you know, the tiers range from like $2 to $5 to $10, and like if you get the lowest one, what you get is like every weekend my friends like I talk to them about all my ideas and what I'm doing in life and all that, and they really want to help me, and so we're going to be doing a live stream regularly, at least one time a week, if not more, where we just hang out and chill and talk about, like, I don't know, gay shit in politics or gay shit in the law or whatever, right? Like, we're just hanging out and having a good time. And if you get the lowest rank on my Patreon, then you will have access to all those streams, right? So that will be tomorrow. So if you want to come on by, then yeah, check it out. All right, that's enough of my plug. It's the first shameless plug of my channel, so I have to. All right. I hope to see y'all there, and yeah, I'll catch you around. Peace, fam.